Hi, everyone. My name is Ben MacKinnon. I'm a senior studying public health and psychology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm a member of their Commonwealth Honors College, and for my senior honors thesis, I decided to look into how team-based learning fosters student well-being in higher education. So a little bit of background on this topic. Two early concepts for active modes of instruction were adult learning theory and team-based learning. Adult learning theory was introduced in 1968, and it emphasized the importance of keeping adult learners engaged through four key principles: respect, immediacy, experience, and the idea that adults learn 20% of what they hear, 40% of what they hear and see, and 80% of what they discover for themselves. Team-based learning was derived from adult learning theory in the mid-1970s with the goal to improve student engagement in college courses through more active learning. And the four key components of team-based learning were carefully formed and managed teams, frequent and timely feedback, student peer evaluation, as well as problem solving. So some key theorists whose ideas were relevant to team-based learning and where I want to take this thesis were Drs. Terrell Strayhorn, Alexander W. Aston, and Dan Gerber. Strayhorn was the author of College Student Sense of Belonging, a key to educational success for all students. And in this piece, he emphasized the importance of student-faculty relationships, which I'll touch on in my data a little bit later. Aston developed the involvement theory, which states for maximum growth and learning to occur, the student must be actively engaged on their campus. And in his research, he deemed the peer group as the most important source of involvement. And Dr. Dan Gerber, who I've worked with for multiple semesters, was actually the primary advocate for the implementation of team-based learning at UMass Amherst. He was also the author of Demonstrating Excellence in Practice-Based Teaching in Public Health. So some well-being frameworks that I would like to explain next are what the University of Massachusetts defines as the 8 key dimensions of well-being. Those are academic, emotional, environmental, financial, intellectual, physical, social, and spiritual. And I felt as though 4 of these were most applicable to team-based learning and being in a classroom environment. And those were academic well-being, as well as social, emotional, and intellectual well-being. So what we know right now are the academic benefits. There's been a lot of prior research on the academic benefits of team-based learning environments, and these studies have led us to realize that students in team-based learning have higher knowledge retention, improved classroom engagement, better problem-solving skills, and a heightened student confidence leaving the class. But the social, emotional, and intellectual benefits of this team-based learning style of education are unknown. So that led me to my thesis, my main hypothesis being UMass students who engage in team-based learning will self-report higher levels of social, emotional, and intellectual well-being compared to those enrolled in lecture-based learning. And my methods to complete this was going to be through descriptive research. I decided to use a survey as my method via Google Forms, and this was with a combination of Likert scale and short answer questions. I felt as though these are most appropriate because they are anonymous and they could be comparable, as I've worked with quantitative data before, and as you'll see later, they were very easy to compare to draw my conclusions. In terms of criteria for this study, for participants, they had to have either been currently enrolled in a team-based learning or lecture-style course, as well as completed or be currently enrolled in a lecture-style course to have that comparison. And for my responses, I needed at least 40 to 50 responses so I could deem this statistically significant, because that would be in line with the prior studies done on academic benefits, and those were deemed statistically significant. And I ended up with 43 responses, so I finished right in that range, which is great to see. So now onto my findings. In terms of social well-being, which UMass defines as being created by connecting to friends, community, and support systems. The first question I asked was, how connected do you feel to your peers? And comparing the team-based learning and lecture-style courses, the majority of team-based learning students felt connected to their peers, whereas nearly all lecture students felt disconnected from their peers. I also asked the students and participants to give 3 words to describe their connection to their peers. I used a word cloud where these larger words were the ones seen more frequently in the responses. Students commonly described their connection in team-based learning courses as friendly, engaging, helpful, and interactive, where students described their connection in a lecture style course as distant, disconnected, and non-existent. Moving on to emotional well-being, which UMass describes as coping effectively with life and creating positive relationships. For this, I asked, how supported do you feel by your peers in each course? And again, we see the majority of responses identifying team-based learning environments as conducive to peer support, and the lecture styles sort of lacking peer support. I also asked the same question for how supported students felt by their professors in both courses. And while students did seem to feel supported in both courses, many felt strongly supported by their professors in the team-based learning course, whereas in a lecture style course, students tended to feel more neutral about how supported they felt. So again, 3 words to describe how supported the students felt in team-based learning. They felt as though these courses were helpful, engaged, supported, and the students felt heard. Whereas in lecture style courses, students described their sense of support as less connected, distant, and independent. So definitely a clear difference there. And lastly, intellectual well-being, which UMass says exercises your creativity, expands your skills, and provides opportunities to learn new things. For this, I phrased the question as, how would you rate your intellectual freedom? And I put in parentheses creativity and opportunities to learn, just so people kind of knew what we were looking for, what intellectual freedom really was. And they rated their responses on a scale of strongly free to not free at all. Team-based learning courses were reported mostly free and strongly free, but by about twice as many students compared to students in the lecture style course. And as you can see here, the students in the lecture style courses also seem to really lack freedom in the curriculum, but with the majority of responses stating slightly free or not free at all. And in terms of the word clouds to describe the intellectual freedom, in team-based learning courses, it was described as creative, free, innovative, and open. And whereas in lecture courses, while some students also did describe the curriculum as open, most described it as limited, structured, and non-existent. So on to a little bit of discussion about the data. In terms of social well-being, team-based learning students were significantly more connected to one another, and they use much more positive words to describe their social well-being. In terms of emotional well-being, more than 50% of students felt unsupported by their peers in lecture, whereas less than 10% felt unsupported in team-based learning. And in terms of their professors, team-based learning students were overwhelmingly more supported compared to those in lectures. And in terms of intellectual well-being, lastly, compared to lecture courses, team-based learning courses received much more positive responses and significantly less negative responses about their intellectual well-being and freedom for creativity in the course. So this leads me to my conclusion that based on my data that is statistically in line with prior studies on student well-being, team-based learning does foster better social, emotional, and intellectual well-being in higher education. Thank you.